President Harker, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. And we're going to get to some of the amazing work that you and your team at the Philadelphia Fed have been doing when it comes to creating economic resiliency and workers. But before that, I kind of want to just set the scene and the backdrop because we have so many big stories this year. You're in Philadelphia. We know that that was in the news a lot because of the election and the race. What I'm curious about is, how do you see the election outcome, new leadership potentially, new policies, and what that means for workers in Philadelphia specifically, and what it means for workers around the country, many of which are really struggling right now?
So first, thanks, Carol, for having me on. And without getting into the specifics of the election, I think the message that I take away from this is workers want to, feel like they're valued and that they're rewarded for their work. And people who haven't made it yet, right? People who want to get into the middle class, they need a ladder up. They need a rung up on the ladder. They feel frustrated. And that's not just in the urban centers. That's true across the country. I think about my district in rural Pennsylvania. They feel the same way. So I think that's the work we're trying to do at the Philly Fed, is to figure out how to accelerate that process to bring more people into the middle class.
And we're going to break it all down. What do you think about, though, in terms of a new administration, in terms of leadership, and in terms of really the meaningful policy discussions that we need to be having when it comes to workers? Because it's amazing, and you and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, in terms of forgotten workers. It's not just a 2020 thing. It's been around for years.
Right. Exactly. And I think first, I'm looking forward to having policy discussions, right? Deep policy discussion, having a debate. This is the nature of our democracy, having that debate. And I think this is worthy of a serious debate. I think this is one of the most critical problems we have, because if we don't solve this problem, then people lose hope, right? And when they lose hope, lots of bad things happen, whether to their health or to their communities. So we've got to focus on this right now.
So I also want to ask you one other macro. What is the economic backdrop that we're going to be dealing with as workers? One of the things I know we have a lot of conversations in our newsroom is workers are worried. They're either worried about keeping their job or they don't have a job. What's the economic backdrop we're going to be dealing with for the next 6 to 12 months?
So start out quickly. Before the pandemic hit us, we had a strong economy. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't perfect for everyone, but it was strong. This pandemic has shown us a lot of problems that we have, underlying problems we've had in our society, whether they're racial injustice and inequity, or just the fragility of somebody and their family in terms of their well-being. That has now been exacerbated. Plus, it's accelerated trends we already saw with respect to automation and other trends that we saw. So this pandemic, I think, we're not just going to snap right back to the previous economy. I think that's unrealistic. There are people, though, that need to be retrained. This has accelerated, for example, trends in retail, right? We've seen that. I don't think retail is going to come back in the same way. So we're going to have to figure out how to retrain that workforce, and not just to get a different job at the same pay, but ideally at a better job with higher skills.
How worried are you about the U.S. labor force when you think about it overall? Because you know what's interesting? I feel like if you go back to when the major auto companies, right, all over Detroit, I mean, you know, working in a Ford plant or a GM plant, that was a great middle class job. You supported your family well. Those have been gone for a long time, and I feel like now we're going to see another cycle of that hit the American worker.
But it's up to us. I really believe I'm an optimist. I'm an engineer by training. I'm an optimist. We can solve this problem. This is not some problem that can't be solved. If we put our minds to it and collectively put our minds to it, government, business, nonprofits, we can move this. And this is the work we're doing at the Philly Fed that we can talk about.
Well, so let's talk about creating economic resiliency when it comes to American workers. You guys have a program. It's called the Economic Growth and Mobility Project. And as you said, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, you reminded me, the poorest large city in the United States. So you guys have really been looking at your backyard in terms of what, again, has been a systemic problem. Tell us about this program and what you're doing.
So it starts from decades of work we've done and a major conference we do every other year called Reinventing Our Communities, which I really like this conference. It brings together policymakers, academics, philanthropies, business leaders, to mix it up, to figure out how to come up with practical solutions to solve the problems we face. We then doubled down on that when we put together our Economic Growth and Mobility Project, or what we call EGMP. EGMP has three legs to this stool of how to create a more resilient economy. One is creating good jobs, what we call opportunity occupations, jobs that pay above median wages, i.e. middle-class jobs, where you don't necessarily need a four-year college degree, right? Pathways to success that don't necessarily require a college degree. Second is innovation in skills training. And then third is, I broadly characterize it as infrastructure. Housing, transportation, broadband access, you could put healthcare access in that. If you can't get to a job or the job can't get to you, you don't have a job. So you have to solve all three of these things together systemically to make a real difference. That's the work we're doing right now.
Well, that's what, even just that whole idea of infrastructure. You gave us an example when you and I talked, getting ready for this conversation about, there were jobs, but people just couldn't physically get to them.
Yeah, so the EGMP program has research on those three stools. And then we have what we call research and action labs. And these are deep dives into a community on a problem in that community, but we think it's a problem more broadly. People are suffering this all across the country. So the first one we took on was Northeast PA. Northeast PA, the Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, Hazleton area. There were jobs out on the highways. There are logistics jobs, truck repair jobs, et cetera. And by the way, these jobs can be good jobs, like truck repair, diesel mechanics can make upwards of six figures in these jobs. But the people, low-income people living in, say, the city of Scranton, didn't have cars to get to those jobs, particularly in second and third shift. So we organized a conference. We brought some national experts in, and then we helped organize a group with a local university at the heart of this to help solve that problem. They now have something called NEPA Moves, Northeast PA Moves, and they're solving this problem. They're figuring out how to do this. What I like about this story is Geisinger, the main healthcare system up there, they were all in on this. I mean, they were very supportive. But then they realized, it's not just about jobs. If somebody misses a doctor's appointment, it costs us $70 when they added up the cost. And then they figured out it's worth it to us to help that person get to that doctor appointment. So they created a system where they help people get on transit to get there. And if there's a last mile or miles that need to be closed, they close it with an Uber or a van. That kind of creative thinking is what we need to spread across the country.
It sounds like, too, that public-private partnership, this is an important part of all of this. Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And the second one we're doing with respect to our action lab is around workforce development. A major tech company in Philadelphia partnering with the government job training board to create a customized program to train workers that they need. And what's different about this, and we think this is the first of its kind in the U.S., is that firm is then reimbursing the government entity for every successful hire, success being successful on the job for several months. That's never really happened before. Here's a true public-private partnership where it's not just in words, it's in action and putting money on the table to help accelerate this process.
How did COVID impact all of this? Because I think about pre-COVID, we were looking at a really strong labor force. We didn't have enough workers out there. Yeah. So how has COVID exacerbated this situation? What kind of setback has been, given to American workers as a result of it?
So as I said earlier, this tragic pandemic we're living through has accelerated trends we already saw in training. Right. So automation being one of those. And we know those jobs that are being automated are often jobs held by low-income people, by women, and by underrepresented minorities. Our research documents that, and there's others who have documented that as well. So that's just made the situation worse for people who are fragile. I mean, their situation economically is very fragile. And so here is where we really need to focus on retraining those people into different jobs as quickly as we can. And there are jobs for them. I mean, one of the studies that we did, which I'm really excited about, our economists and the economists at Cleveland Fed looked at the following situation. They said, take a low-skilled job that may be going away because of automation or because of the pandemic, say travel and tourism or hospitality. Map that skill set that they have, like a sales skill set they can sell, to a higher paying job. And what's the skill set that you need, the training that you need to do that? They looked at 33 metro areas across the US, and roughly half the jobs they could match from one skill set to a higher skill set with an average increase in salary, annual salary of $15,000, a 49% increase in salary. So this is real. That's the opportunity if we just work together to make this happen.
You know, I looked at that research. So you're talking about, you may take bakers and they become butchers and meat cutters. You take electromechanical technicians, they become electrical and electronics engineering technicians. You take receptionists and information clerks, they become medical secretaries. It's so easy, right? It's a similar skill set, but the financial income benefit is huge for these people.
Right. And what we need to stop in the skill workforce training business, there's a phrase that people use called the train and pray model. And the train and pray model is basically, we think this is the skill set the market needs. We're going to train them, and then we're going to pray that they get a job. That we need to break the back of. And this is where public-private partnerships, like the one I just mentioned with this tech firm, really important. They have worked with the training entity to design the program, and they will hire everyone coming out of that who successfully completed the training because they know the skills that they're getting because they were part of the design. We need to break down these barriers between the public and private sector to make this happen.
Well, I think this is a really important point. You and I talked about this because I said, you know, does everybody need a college education? And we talked about Europe in terms of, you know, tradespeople, right? I mean, that is a great job. You can support your families, you can make a good income. But something's happened in the United States where I think, and this is the onus on leaders, that maybe not everybody needs a college degree to do a certain job.
Yeah, so this is a funny thing to say. I'm the former president of the University of Delaware. And a lifelong academic.
We won't tell them.
You know, I was on the faculty of Penn for a long time in academic administration. But so this is an odd thing for me to say, but you're absolutely right. Not everybody needs a college degree or a college degree right away, right? You may get there, but you don't need it right away. And I think it comes down to a very basic fact. I mean, I'm a first-generation college kid from a family of steam fitters and pipe fitters. And they were good middle-class jobs. And they were jobs that were honored in my community. These were people that, you know, were recognized and admired in the community. We need to get back to that. We need to honor those trades. We need to honor that work. And this comes down to when you talk to parents. We've sent the message too long in this country that the only path to the middle class, the only path to success is a college degree. And people have bought that. I mean, and understandably. Now, is a college degree a path to that life? Yes, but it's not the only path to that life. And not everybody is designed for that. Not everybody, it doesn't meet everybody's needs. So I think we need to break the back of that thinking and really honor the trades, honor the skills. And you think about it, I have a friend, an old neighbor, who's my electrician. He runs his own business. He's an entrepreneur. He enjoys running his own business. So it's more than just the skill. It's being able to live the life you want to live. We got to get back to that. Now, again, and you think about college right away. Well, there are certain companies. There's one company in the Philadelphia area that through their apprenticeship program, apprentices get credit at a local community college. And then one guy I met there, he finished his associate's degree, and then they saw him as, you know, potential for a supervisor. So he's now finishing up his bachelor's degree, all being paid for by the company. Again, there are different pathways. We have to stop this path of everybody goes from high school to college and life. It just doesn't work that way.
So one thing I want to ask you, because the work that you did and you guys at the Philly Fed, the importance of an equitable workforce recovery, we are at this kind of interesting juncture, right, because of COVID. And if I can, I think you gave a speech and you said even for COVID-19, racial minorities, particularly Black Americans, had higher unemployment rates, lower wealth, and poorer health outcomes than white Americans. So right now, we have a lot of people who are left behind, but we're at an interesting point where we can pull those people, and especially racial minorities, into having an ability to support themselves in a better way and be part of this system.
Right. So let's start with a very basic fact that I think often gets overlooked. If we want the economy that we all think we deserve as Americans, we have to solve this problem of bringing people into the middle class. It's not just the right thing to do morally. It's all good for all of us. That's how we grow.
We all benefit, right?
We all benefit by doing this. So getting more racial minorities, more women into the workforce with the skills they need to be successful benefits absolutely all of us. And so, but there are barriers to this. There are barriers to this that we need to break down. For example, in the small business world, I'll just talk about the small business world. The one thing we learned, for example, in the PPP program to help support small businesses, a lot of minority-owned small businesses, particularly those called micro-enterprises, right, with very few employees, they didn't have access to the PPP program. Why? They didn't have existing banking relationships. There are a lot of reasons why they didn't have an existing banking relationship, but we should just see that as unacceptable. And this is one of the areas, for example, in the Federal Reserve System as a federal regulator, I personally am focused on, because I think we can solve this problem. We can help figure out a win-win where the banks can be successful serving those customers, and those customers can be successful. There's just one example of minority-owned businesses that need access to the banking system. By getting them into the banking system, we all benefit.
Well, and if I can follow up, because the Federal Reserve does work with the financial system within the country, how come we haven't been able to fix this? Because I do feel like small business owners, as you said, micro-enterprise business owners, constantly, and Black Americans, people of color, are constantly left out of the financial system, and that hurts them.
Yeah. So some of it is, some of it's very basic, and there's work going on. For example, if you think about credit scores, so this is all based typically lending in an institution on credit scores. Well, you don't really get a decent credit score if you rent versus you own a home, right? You don't get credit for paying your rent, your utilities, et cetera, on time. Well, this is something we can change. By working with the industry, we can figure out a way to create new metrics where they don't take on more risk than they want to, but then the customers can benefit. There's just one example of the many things we need to do to try to break down those barriers.
So one thing I want to go back to in terms of having the right skills, because our sponsor of this event, Prudential, they've got a survey out. And one of the things that jumped out was that more than a quarter of American workers, 27%, are concerned they will not have the skills for the jobs that will be available once the economy starts back up. Because we've talked a lot at Bloomberg about disruption, industries, retail, you name it, medicine, it's all changing.
Right.
How do we address that?
This goes back to the research we were talking about. We actually know what those jobs are. We know the skill sets that are needed for the jobs in the future. This is not an unknowable problem. This is not an unsolvable problem. We just need to put our collective minds together to make it happen.
One thing I wonder, too, is, it's interesting because, as you said, this is really an opportune time to kind of maybe think about how we hire people, the skills that are needed. But I do wonder about the stresses that are in the system. There are companies that are just barely getting by. And you're talking about the importance of having the private sector involved. How do we make that happen? Are there government policies that can be supportive, right? We know tax policy shapes, it's why we own homes, it's why we do things. What can we do in terms of policies that make private employees more supportive of the type of workers that you're talking about, that you're working at the Philly Fed, to bring into the workforce in a stronger way?
Right. So obviously at the Fed, we have to be careful about straying out of our lane in terms of talking about fiscal policy. But that said, I think there are some basic lessons that we can learn. Right. One is economic incentives given by government, say tax credits or others for job training, make a lot of sense. But I believe they have to be targeted in a way that maybe they haven't before, because I would encourage more of these public-private partnerships through those kind of tax credits. Because in doing that, we can get the multiplier effect that we need. That's one. The second area, I mean, there are many areas we can talk about, but the second area, for example, is as we're rethinking, along with our fellow regulators, federal regulators, the Community Reinvestment Act and what you get credit for. We've been moving in this direction for a while now. Traditionally, when that started in the 1970s, it was primarily around things like low-income housing. Today, we can think of, for example, if a bank invests in transit in Northeast PA, like we were talking about earlier, to help low-income workers get to a job, that's a credit. You know, it's helping the community. So we need to think more broadly about the kind of investments that get credit under CRA.
You mentioned the three-legged stool. What's the successes that you've seen in Philadelphia as a result of the programs and the work that you guys have been doing at the Fed?
So it's beginning. I think it's in the early stages. I wouldn't declare success by any stretch. This is going to be it's going to be a process. It's never going to end.
Yeah.
But what I think the greatest success I've seen is it's starting to change the mindset of what's possible and is starting to break down these barriers between public and private sector. That, to me, is the greatest win, because if we can prove this concept, and that's the whole point of these action labs, to prove the concept, then we can replicate this all across the country.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you, because we were having some discussions and we're talking about, Americans don't move around, right? Mobility just isn't like it used to be. Yeah. And you know the numbers, it's down dramatically over the last few decades. Do we need Americans to be able to move around? How do we make what you guys are doing and started in Philadelphia work across the country? Because it kind of breaks my heart to look at some of our major cities and they're not strong. And ultimately, if you don't have strong cities, you don't have a strong country.
Yeah. So you're right. We have not moved as a people like we used to move. Basically, if you look at the history, once we settled the West and stopped moving to the West, we pretty much settled in. And there are reasons for that, right? I mean, it's parents relying on their parents to take care of their kids and, a whole host of reasons, or taking care of elderly parents. Lots of reasons why this might be the case. So what I think we've learned out of this pandemic is if we can't bring people to the job, many jobs you can bring the job to the people, but they have to have broadband access. They have to. A friend of mine who's in the Midwest has been working on an initiative to create more cyber security jobs in the upper Midwest, where people are, and they have the skills. They can be trained. You don't need to be physically there to do a cybersecurity job, and you don't even need a bachelor's degree to do many of these cybersecurity jobs. At Delaware, we worked with the U.S. Army to help create with the community colleges in the area the cybersecurity associate's degrees. They're the kind of jobs of the future that where geography doesn't play a big role. So let's start thinking about community by community, what strengths they have there, and how they can invest in those job training programs to get those jobs there.
Do you think working from home and what's happened during COVID kind of changes it? As you said, you've got to have access to broadband, you have to have access to internet, but can that, in a big way, bring people into better paying jobs ultimately?
Oh yeah, I think that's possible. Again, but we have to do this thoughtfully, and we have to make some investments in infrastructure, et cetera, to make it happen.
If we don't get this right, if we don't think about economic resiliency, because can we get to economic resiliency with American jobs that really can kind of get through the cycles, get through the shocks? Can we get to a point with our workforce?
So it's never going to be perfect. There are always going to be business cycles. We're never going to completely get rid of business cycles. But we can make families more resilient by doing a couple of things. Jobs are one, we're talking about that. But it's also issues like financial literacy and helping people plan for their futures more extensively than they have. There's a whole host of policies that we can put in place. But yeah, I think this is absolutely possible. In fact, I think it's imperative. The economy will not grow unless we bring people up from the lower skill jobs into the middle class. It just simply won't grow. The math won't work.
I mean, ultimately, it's not then just workers being left behind. If we don't get this right, it's a country being left behind, especially as I look at countries like China who are setting their policy for the next decade and they're thinking about growth and developing industries, but we will be left behind as a nation on the global scale.
Absolutely. I think this is the challenge of our generation right now, is to fix this problem. And it is fixable. It is not something we can't fix. We can do this.
So just to wrap up, and I think about all the leaders who are listening to you right now and probably, taking tons and tons of notes about what they need to do. What needs to be their role? What do we need to do to create a lasting and resilient workforce after COVID, and a diverse workforce where it really pulls in everybody that's inclusive? What would be your leaving, your piece of advice, or things that they need to think about, or actions that they need to take, right? Because we've talked a lot, but what are the actions you take?
So I can tell you, I use Philadelphia as an example. The Greater Philadelphia Chamber of Commerce is completely dedicated to this initiative. So reach out to your local Chamber of Commerce. I'm sure they're interested in this exact same question, and they can connect you to nonprofits if you're interested, into other organizations, and just be part of that community and that life through different organizations. I'm just picking the Chamber as one, but I know in Philadelphia, they've been very active in trying to deal with this issue, and not just deal with the issue of resilience, but also with a racial equity lens, bringing people, underrepresented minorities, more strongly into the workforce.